Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. On behalf of Rowley Books, I would like to welcome you to the launch of Flora Indica, Recovering Lost Stories from Kew's Indian Drawings by Henry Noltie. I'd like to begin by first thanking Ratish for so generously opening the doors of the Humayun's Tomb Museum to us in this lovely auditorium. There could not be a more fitting setting. This is a space that lives and breathes history, and for a book so deeply engaged with memory, archives, and the layered cultural journeys of the subcontinent, it feels absolutely right that we gather here today. We're especially delighted to have Henry Noltie with us this evening. Henry is in India for the first time in 6 years, and his timing couldn't be better as we launched the Indian edition of his much acclaimed book alongside the wonderful exhibition at Kew Gardens in London. For 3 decades, Henry worked at the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh as a taxonomist, curator, and historian of its Indian collections. Shortly after retirement at Edinburgh, Henry was called upon by William Dalrymple to assist with the exhibition William was curating for the Wallace collection titled Forgotten Masters in 2019. He asked him to explore the vast Indian collections at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew, and between 2018 and 2022, Henry undertook the extraordinary task of recovering the stories of the Indian artists whose works had lain uncatalogued, completely dispersed, and largely unseen in Kew's archives for generations. So Flora Indica brings together for the first time a selection from a vast collection of over 7,500 drawings. More than 100 exquisite watercolours are reproduced here, but what makes the book so powerful is that it tells the stories of 20 Indian artists, their names, their worlds, and the complex colonial context in which art and science met. While it is certainly a work of rigorous scholarship, it is also a profoundly moving act of recognition. For those of you who know Henry will agree, he is not only the foremost scholar of Indian botanical art and a walking encyclopedia on the subject, he is also wonderfully warm and delightfully funny. His talks are as rich in anecdote and wit as they are in learning. I can promise you're in for a treat. For us at Rowley, it has been a real privilege to publish this Indian edition. In many ways, it feels like the project has come home, back to the country and artistic traditions that made these remarkable works possible in the first place. Before I end, I would also like to thank Lydia White and Gina Fullerlove at Kew Gardens for their continued collaboration with us at Rowley to bring these wonderful publications to Indian readers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Henry Noltie.
Thank you very much indeed, Capral, for those very kind and probably unjustified words, but I'll try not to let you all down. The talk's about what's really a catalogue for the exhibition that I recently co-curated with Dr. Sita Reddy of Hyderabad and Washington, which opened at Kew in October. In it are 52 drawings from Kew's collection of more than 7,500 drawings made by Indian artists for British patrons in India between 1790 and 1850. But in the book, as Capel's just said, it's been possible to reproduce an extra 34 drawings, so about 100 in the book. The book and exhibition represent the latest phase of work that I started in 1998 on the closely related collection at the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, where I spent nearly all my career. So to start with some background, and then I'll take a walk through the 4 galleries, which are the basic 4 chapters of the book, and end with something about the legacy of the exhibition. But to start with, why do Kew and Edinburgh have these precious but little-known collections? The origins of the National Botanic Gardens of Scotland and England are very different. Edinburgh was founded in 1670. It doesn't quite go back to Humayun's tomb, but it does to that of his great-great-grandson, Aurangzeb. Its primary role was to teach medical students about materia medica, the plants from which medicines were made, and was administered jointly by the British Crown and by the Edinburgh Town Council, which ran the city's then century-old university. And this continued until the mid-20th century, when all medical students still had to study botany. But a particularly important time was during the late 18th century, the time of the Scottish Enlightenment, when Edinburgh was the preeminent centre for medical education in Europe. And from it, many graduates went out to the incipient empire, first to the west, to the American and Caribbean colonies, and then to the east, especially here to India, where medics made major contributions to the study and documentation of plant biodiversity, as well as many other fields of knowledge. The professor at the time was called John Hope, and he used illustrations extensively in his lectures, large teaching diagrams and botanical prints and drawings, some of them sent back to him by students from both the Americas and India. In fact, several of the 30 of his students who came to India between 1760 and 1786 were inspired here to commission drawings from the skilled Indian artists, some of the drawings ending up back in Edinburgh, and this continued under subsequent professors until the mid-19th century. But by contrast, Kew, for almost its first century, was a private royal enterprise, a 9-acre botanic garden started by Augusta, Princess of Wales, in 1759 on one of two large royal parks that were combined in 1802, but transferred to the British government only in 1840. And from then on, Kew's remit, initially under Sir William Hooker and then his son Joseph, was both scientific but also explicitly imperialistic in ethos. The scientific element was part of the international effort to document the whole of plant diversity, work essential to understanding evolutionary and biogeographic processes, the basis for documentation of potential change due to climate crisis in our time, and for conservation programs. While it's become fashionable to concentrate on economic aspects and the exploitative aspects of colonialism, it must never be forgotten that a number of species developed commercially, things like opium and tea, quinine and rubber, form only a tiny part of global plant diversity. In the 19th century, Kew's primary link was with the British government, with no formal link to any academic institution, but it acted as a focus for a worldwide network of colonial botanic gardens and the writing of pioneering floras of areas under British control. So this is the sort of thing we're talking about. A Himalayan blue pine on the left, and on the right, Central American sunflower. And Kew's Indian drawings reflect the history of the institution. Some were originally in William Hooker's private collection, which was purchased for the nation after his death in 1865. But more came through the British government, including ones commissioned by employees of the East India companies in the botanic gardens of Calcutta and Saharanpur. And from 1800, the company had its own library and museum in Leadenhall Street in the City of London, where these drawings were deposited. But after 1858, when the British government took over the administration of India, the museum became an embarrassment. It was finally abolished in 1879, when all its botanical material, including more than 1,000 drawings, were transferred to Kew. But Kew also has collections of drawings made by private individuals, donated by descendants, or occasionally purchased. So what happened when these collections arrived at Kew? As I mentioned, since 1840, one of its major roles was taxonomic research. And traditionally this has been based, and to a large extent still is, on the study of dried plant specimens arranged in a herbarium. Kew's worldwide one now has about 7 million specimens. There have always been tensions about the value of illustration in botanical study. But the one that's come to prevail amongst taxonomists is the opposite of the popular one. It's the herbarium specimen, not the illustration, that tells 1,000 words. And this primacy has increased only recently, as DNA can now be extracted from dried specimens, which has revolutionized classification that could previously only be based on morphological characters, such as those recorded, no matter how accurately, by botanical artists. So when a collection arrived at Kew, the drawings were sorted taxonomically, ignoring any artistic quality and largely ignoring any history or geography. They were stuck onto backing sheets so that they could be filed in the same order as the herbarium specimens by family, genus and species. The drawings weren't listed or numbered, and if more than one species was depicted on a sheet, it was cut up so that the parts could be mounted and filed separately. One that I found was cut into 13 different pieces. The backing sheets are also poor quality acidic paper of 2 standard sizes, which meant that the drawings often had to be trimmed or folded to fit them. Those the same size as the herbarium specimens, which is about A3, were kept in the herbarium, but the larger folio drawings were kept in the rare book room in the library. In the late 1990s, I went through the whole of the similar Edinburgh illustrations collection, removed and reformed the pre-1850 Indian drawing collections by commissioner, and catalogued them and undertook projects on the most important of those, 3 of them commissioned by Alexander Gibson in Bombay, Robert White and Hugh Cleghorn in Madras. And I realised that one day someone ought to do the same thing for the Kew collection, never suspecting that it might end up being me. But as Capel just said, in 2018, William Dalrymple approached me for help with the botanical section of the Forgotten Masters exhibition in the Wallace collection in London. He gave me a single day to find some suitable drawings at Kew, typical, but having known the collection, at least in general terms, for 30 years, I was able to make a rough stab, but far from necessarily the best one, so there's many opportunities for further exhibitions. But even then I realised that more work had to be done, so over the next 3 years I went through the whole collection as I'd done at Edinburgh. Now, I'd been an Honorary Research Associate of Kew since 2009 and could undertake the work during visits to Kew from Edinburgh on a voluntary basis, but it was only possible because I then had full access to the herbarium and library collections. So during long weekdays and at weekends, I was able to go through about 250,000 drawings housed between the herbarium and the rare book room, reassembled 15 collections, catalogued 5,500 drawings, and gave them accession numbers for the first time. The cataloguing included identifying the species depicted, their current names, finding which of them had been published, and linking drawings with related herbarium specimens. And perhaps the most important aspect was working out which drawings had been used in the description of new species, what's called type specimens. This is important because it is this that makes the Indian artists significant, if unacknowledged, contributors to the great global taxonomic project. It also included reconnecting scattered parts of drawings that had been cut up by the taxonomists, who viewed them as proxy specimens. I entered up to 15 fields of information into 15 spreadsheets, which I gave to the library in illustrations for use by themselves and visiting researchers. But since then, a problem has struck and bureaucracy has reared its ugly head. New rules are now in operation, so that not being a salaried member of Kew staff, I'm no longer allowed into the rare book room and have only the same access as a member of the general public, which means only being allowed to see 12 drawings at a time. So under this new regime, the exhibition, the book, couldn't have happened, nor indeed can much further research or opening up of the collection, and this despite the fact that all of my work can be seen as having an underlying agenda of decolonisation, which most other British institutions regard as a matter of priority. So how did the exhibition come about? The way the drawings were used by the taxonomists, the cutting up, the sticking on backing sheets, and one's very sooty London air, mean that all of them require the attentions of a paper conservator. And as a matter of priority, they all need to be digitised so that they can be studied by people who can't visit Kew. I wanted the conservation and digitisation to be started as a matter of priority, and I enlisted the help of Gina Fullerlove's, Kew's recently retired head of publications, seen in the orange here, who was looking for a project to work on the Indian drawings. But the powers that be decided that these were not the priorities and that an exhibition should come first, which might raise awareness of the collection with the hope of attracting external funding for the conservation and digitisation. So co-curator Sita Reddy on the left was the ideal colleague. She'd recently edited a volume devoted to Indian botanical art for the Indian periodical Marg, called Ars Botanica, The Weight of a Petal. And at this very moment she's editing a second edition of this, which will come out later this month. But also, Sita in 2021 had written the foreword of a book on the Kew collection, also published by Rowley, written by Martin Ricks, but largely based on my work. But more significantly, Sita and I had collaborated on an exhibition of drawings from the Cleghorn collection in Edinburgh that in 2019 travelled to India in the form of facsimiles. We sent them high-resolution scans. They were printed out as giclée prints in Chennai and framed there. The exhibition started off in a wonderful museum called Dakshina Chitra, just south of Chennai, and then went on to the Goethe Centrum in Hyderabad and the State Archaeological Museum, also in Hyderabad. And it's intended that this Kew exhibition will return to India in a similar form within the next 2 years, to venues in Hyderabad, Bangalore, Mumbai and Kolkata. That's what Sita is also working on at the moment. Now, Kew has a modern art gallery with 6 very unequally sized spaces and an exhibitions team who often prepare a contemporary art exhibition with an archival one. The Singh twins are artist sisters of Sikh heritage from Liverpool, whose work explores themes of colonialism and consumerism, and they'd already been invited to make an exhibition for the autumn of 2025. Their work is in a style they call past modern, deeply researched and intensely colourful, printed onto translucent fabric and displayed as light boxes. The work incorporates images painted by hand using miniature technique, but also a wide range of popular printed imagery. And being Indian in theme, our exhibition was seen as a suitable pairing. I spent a day with the twins in the Kew Library, one of them here rather precariously perched on a ladder, but I'd laid out all the drawings we selected on that long worktop, and they filmed them. And on the right is a detail from one of their new works, and you can see in the foreground 4 of the Kew drawings, rather improbably placed as if they were going to be growing in the garden of the Taj Mahal. I don't think that Himalayan balsam would ever have been grown there, but that's a pedantic detail. The sponsor, who paid part of the cost of the building of the gallery, has a perpetual claim to the second largest space in which to display items from her private collection of contemporary botanical art, which left 4 smaller peripheral galleries in which Sita and I could show a tiny selection from some of Kew's greatest treasures. The major curatorial problem was the sheer embarrassment of the riches, how to choose a representative selection from 7,500 outstanding works. So a co-curator with similar taste but a complementary Indian and American academic and cultural background was the ideal solution, and the exhibition couldn't have happened without Sita's help. One of our major aims was to foreground the skill of the Indian artists and their neglected contribution to science. At the same time, to tell some of the many stories encoded within what are really palimpsests. The drawings are covered in notes by generations of Kew staff and occasionally by the artist or commissioner. They cross perceived divides such as artworks versus artefacts, as well as ones such as Orient-Occident and art versus science. Sita had the idea of 3 narrative arcs: the lives of the artists, the lives of the collection, with an exhibition afterlife beyond Kew, back in India. So what emerged was a title, Flora Indica, Recovering the Lost Histories of Indian Botanical Art, and a theme for each of the 4 galleries, reflected in the 4 chapters of the book. Limitations of space meant excluding any drawings from South or West India, and we had to concentrate rather on the North and the East, but in any case the Kew collection is richest in that material. So in May 2024, Sita came to Kew from Hyderabad for 3 weeks, and we got down to selecting drawings by whizzing through the whole collection on a computer screen. The aim was to balance visual impact with revealing stories, and we steered away from plants such as medicines and spices, which had already been thoroughly covered in previous Kew exhibitions. We want to show that all plants are of interest, not just those that happen to be of use to man. We also wanted to give more nuanced stories when so many of the decolonising narratives can be so reductive. Heaven alone knows if we've succeeded in coming up with something satisfactory. Our only advantage is that none of the visitors know what we had to miss out. Another essential aspect was to show the interlinked nature of the varied collections housed at Kew: herbarium specimens, illustrations, archives, printed books, and ethnobotanical artefacts in their amazing economic botany collection. But this related material had to be carefully chosen because we only had 2 tiny display cases available. So with difficulty we selected 62 drawings, which we measured to fit the space available. The intention was for a dense hang to hold its own against the richly coloured work of the Singh twins, which we knew was going to be set against walls of dark indigo. Our galleries are the first to be entered from daylight, so we had to lead up to the central Singh space by means of increasingly strong colours on the walls of the 4 galleries, which have to be lit at low 50 lux illumination. The exhibition team then made us cut the number of drawings on the grounds that the paper conservators wouldn't be able to process so many, even though they had 2 years, and that having so many drawings would risk being visually chaotic. And when we protested, we were told that our work was a collaboration, but Kew had the final say on such matters. So we had to remove 10 drawings, leaving the final 52, though the original selection are all in the book. That's enough of the background. So to give you a taste, of the exhibition, I'll show you 5 or 6 drawings from each of the 4 main galleries. So starting with the first one, which is painted a sort of cafe au lait colour and is devoted to the artists, foregrounding the creators of the work of artists whose names we know. Traditionally, of course, much Indian art, including most of the botanical drawings, is unsigned and therefore has to be regarded as anonymous. The artists, though they were relatively well paid, left no written records themselves. Well, there's a single letter in English from one of them. So any knowledge we have of them comes almost entirely through the information provided by their patrons, which is obviously highly biased. And discovering such information has been a laborious process, going through many, many archives, both in India and in Britain. But in Gallery 1, it's been possible to show a wide range of work by 8 named artists, with works by a further 6 in the other galleries. And in the book, there are sketchy details given for a total of 22 named artists. This sort of naturalistic work was alien to Indian artists of whatever school or background, but with traditional and finely honed skills in draftsmanship and on being shown Western drawings from models, the artists were able to fulfill the commissioner's desire for scientific accuracy, while at the same time expressing their own flair for design when it came to the placement on the page. One of the patrons who wrote the artist's name on the many drawings was the Scottish surgeon Adam Freer, who'd been a pupil of John Hope in the 1760s, though this has only recently become known, as I'll describe later. But in Bengal, between 1808 and 1810, he employed a team of 5 Hindu and 2 Muslim artists. The former had the surname Lal, a family of painters based in Patna. And this drawing of a familiar chickpea is by Sam Lal, whose work is particularly decorative in terms of layout and executed in more transparent watercolour than the more usual thicker body colour. One of the greatest of all the Indian botanical artists was called Gaurachand. He too may have had a Patna background and was working in the Calcutta Botanic Garden by 1813, when this drawing was made for its then acting director, the Sanskritist Henry Colebrook. Although of an upper caste, Gaurachand defied its ban on crossing the Black Water when in 1826 he accompanied Colebrook's successor, Wallich, on an expedition to Burma, where he sadly succumbed to fever. This is Gaurachand's drawing of a climbing legume called Mucuna monosperma, a fine example of the elegant layout combined with exquisite miniature detail that you can see on the fruit at the top left. That's so characteristic of Indian botanical artists. The name of Vishnu Prasad is first recorded in 1805 when he was drawing birds and animals in the Governor-General's menagerie at Barrackpur near Calcutta. And after employment on Francis Buchanan's 7-year survey of the natural and man-made resources of Bengal, he joined the Calcutta Botanic Garden staff, where he must have learned from Gaurachand, whom he rapidly equalled or even excelled. And on Gaurachand's death, he became the garden's head painter until his own death in 1835. This is his drawing of Impatiens glandulifera, the Himalayan balsam, a plant that in a case of reverse colonisation has become invasive along British riverbanks. It also shows how the drawings were treated by taxonomists if more than one species was shown on a sheet. So Joseph Hooker even signed his act of vandalism on either side of the cut, that sort of strange top left section. The main part, the coloured bit, I found in the folio drawings in the rare book room. The smaller part, the top left one, showing a much less imposing species and uncoloured, I found many months later in the herbarium cabinet of dried Impatiens specimens. But as their work for the exhibition, the Kew paper conservators made a wonderful job restoring the original artist's intention and putting Humpty Dumpty back together again on the right. The third of the great Calcutta-based artists was called Lakshman Singh, who had an extraordinarily long career from 1827 to 1863. He drew not only plants but birds, animals and portraits of people in a late Mughal style. While Vishnu Prasad and Gaurachand may have come from artistic backgrounds in Patna, Lakshman seems to have been different and was probably from the Pahari school of miniature painting. And a unique story relates to him, as recorded by Hugh Faulkner in a letter to Wallich. While in Saharanpur, Lakshman, quotes, contracted dissipated habits here, and at last, getting deeply in debt, took up with a Musalmani woman and lost caste with his brethren. In consequence, he made an attempt to run away, but was caught 3 marches from Saharanpur. Well, the poor boy's next attempt was more successful, and he went AWOL for 9 months to the Himalayan desert of Garhwal, which is probably where he came from. But Faulkner clearly regarded him as a lovable rogue as well as a superb artist, and if Wallach didn't want him back in Calcutta, he offered to pay his debts and keep him on in Saharanpur. So this is one of Lakshman's earliest drawings of Filipendula vestita, a West Himalayan plant closely related to the British meadow sweet. But we felt it was important to remind people that many drawings remain anonymous and that much remains to be discovered. So we included this anonymous drawing of a crinum as the last drawing in that gallery from the collection of Claude Martin, which was made in Lucknow in the 1790s. Martin was a soldier who deserted the French East India Company and ended up working both for the English one and for the Nawab of Awadh. He had wide interest in the arts and sciences and employed Indian artists to make drawings of birds and plants, but sadly he neglected to record any of their names. The next two galleries focus on drawings made in the two great East India Company gardens of Calcutta and Saharanpur. This one with turmeric-coloured walls is devoted to the Calcutta Botanic Garden, which was founded in 1787 by a remarkably enlightened Scottish soldier called Colonel Robert Kidd. His aim was in part to experiment with plants of potential economic value to the company, but also with ones useful for the alleviation of famine, which had recently ravaged Bengal. And in 1793, its first superintendent was a Scottish surgeon, another Hope pupil, called William Roxburgh, who had been undertaking similar experimental botanical work in South India, where he employed artists who were probably textile painters to record plants he was describing in words. He took his head painter to Calcutta and recruited there 4 more, including Gorachand, but like Claude Martin, he failed to record any of their names, even when their work was published, as some of it was in London. By the time Roxburgh left India in 1813, he'd commissioned drawings of about 2,500 Indian species. A copy of each drawing was made. One of them was sent to the company's library in London, the other one kept for himself. The company's set is now at Kew, and his own remains in the Botanic Garden in Calcutta. But because many of his drawings had been made in South India, we had to exclude them from the exhibition, but we simply had to show one because they formed the foundation of the garden's great collection of drawings. And this, of the Singara nut, the water chestnut, is certainly made by one of the artists recruited in Bengal. And please remember it, so I'll show a very different drawing of the same plant later on. Roxburgh and his successors used the garden as a base for exploring the plants of India and Southeast Asia. And while some of this was economically driven, such as seeking and translocating spice plants, the surgeon botanists played a double act. With a thirst to satisfy their own scientific documentation of all plants, they also had to have an eye to the company, whose interest was revenue generation or saving money by finding indigenous substitutes, especially for medicines. Botany wasn't the only biological science of interest to the company, and to improve the bloodstock of Indian horses, they employed a vet. William Moorcroft was also a keen botanist, and on an excursion to the Trans-Himalaya, found this umbellifer called Prangos pabularia. He hoped that it might become a useful fodder crop for arid regions. It didn't work out, but from the dried specimens sent back as hay to Calcutta, Gorachand did his best to make this drawing, including a superb detail of the massive root, which clearly survived the journey rather better than the above-ground plants. And again, please remember this one, as I'll show you another picture of it later. Now, after Roxburgh left in 1813, his indirect successor as superintendent was someone called Nathaniel Wallach, who was unique amongst company employees in not being British. Not only was he Danish, but he was Jewish as well. Wallach continued Roxburgh's work of botanical exploration and the employment of the team of 5 artists, and through a network of collectors and correspondents, British, Indian and Anglo-Indian, he amassed a huge herbarium, which he took to London on leave between 1828 and 1832, along with 1,200 drawings that had been made for him over the previous 10 years by the garden's artists. And when he was in London, he published almost 300 of these as superb hand-coloured lithographs, on which he, for the first time, gave the name of the head painter responsible, which is how we know who did which. Now, Wallace took his artists on two important excursions, first to Nepal in 1820, and then to Burma in 1826, where, as you've heard, Gaurachand sadly died. And it was in a temple garden in Burma that Wallace was shown this spectacular scarlet-flowered leguminous tree, which he named after the Governor-General's wife as Amherstia nobilis. This is a drawing by by Vishnu Prasad. And when I was in Bombay recently, I was thrilled to see trees of it in beautiful flower. Another of Wallace's Burmese finds was this plant, which is actually a palm with no stem and spiny petioles. It also has an edible fruit, and was named for him in Germany as Salacca wallichiana. This drawing, also by Vishnu Prasad, is another example of fragmentation, not from the taxonomist's scalpel this time, but from folding and subsequent breakage. The lower part I found in the rare book room, placed correctly in a folder of palm drawings, but the missing upper part eventually I found in a cover of unidentified ferns. But it's only by having such access to the collections that it's been possible to make such reconnections. In 1849, several of the garden's artists were lent to a retired judge called John Ferguson Cathcart, who, whilst convalescing in Darjeeling, embarked on an ambitious project to illustrate the local flora. He borrowed 3 artists from Calcutta, including Lakshman Singh. And uniquely amongst the Kew collections, a large proportion of these drawings bear annotations written by the artists themselves. You can see one on the right. They're in pencil and in a difficult Bengali script, but a translation project has begun, which shows them to be the artist's name and the date and place of the plant's collection. So here is a beautiful drawing of Begonia sycamensis, with Lakshman Singh's signature in the bottom right-hand corner. So this made 20 years after that Filipendula we saw earlier, but still at the height of his powers. Now, coming to the Russet Gallery devoted to the Saharanpur Botanic Garden. In 1817, the company took over the garden of the Rohilla chieftain Zabita Khan at Saharanpur to develop as a second botanic garden under another Edinburgh-trained surgeon, George Govan. It's 100 miles north of Delhi and was an ideal base for exploring the Western Himalaya and Kashmir, and where they could grow less tropical plants than those that thrived in steamy Calcutta. Govan had to pay a local artist out of his own pocket, so the drawings were his own property, though later given to Kew by his family. But in 1828, Govan's successor, John Forbes Royal, benefited from Wallace's London leave when the Calcutta artists were transferred to Saharanpur, where they made about 400 drawings for Royal. In the foreground of the left-hand slide is a rather dizzying, strange angled photograph of one of the display cases to show the interconnected nature of the Kew collections. So starting in the centre, you've got a original painting of a thistle called Dolomea macrocephala. To its left, you can see the one in the centre, the actual specimen. To the left, very faint, is the painting made by one of the Calcutta artists, and then on the left is the book, The Illustrations of Himalayan Botany by Royal, in which the drawing was lithographed in London. And then on the right-hand side of the case, you've got Pinus gerardiana, a beautiful pine from the drier parts of the Western Himalayas that has delicious pine nuts, which are seen in the foreground, with the pine cones in the top right from the Kew Economic Botany collection. And in the centre, a unique drawing. The artist, probably Vishnu Prasad, drew the vegetative branch of the pine without having seen the cone, and then later when an immature cone was found, it was added on a separate bit of card and added as a sort of pop-up. Royal, the second director of Saharanpur, was particularly interested in medicinal plants, and also ones mentioned in classical European and Indian literature, such as spikenard or jatamansi. The British have always been obsessed with their bowels, too runny or not forthcoming, and the strongly purgative root of various species of rhubarb was particularly helpful for the latter affliction. Britain was then spending large amounts of money on medicinal rhubarb from China, so Royal decided to investigate the various rhubarbs native to British Himalayan territory to see if they might have equally powerful purgative properties and save money on imports. This is one of them, Rheum webianum, and he sent it to the Calcutta hospital where it was tested and found to be effective. The Calcutta artists were still at Saharanpur when Hugh Falconer took over from Royal, but they had to return to base in 1832. And it wasn't until 1838 that Falconer was able again to employ artists. Sadly, these are unnamed, but they were probably locally recruited, and they painted in a much bolder style than the Calcutta artists, as seen in this spectacular poppy. But here's another example of what, from an art historian's point of view, is bad treatment. Trimmed to fit a predetermined backing sheet, the petal detail on the top left had to be cut around and then folded over. Thank goodness in this case it didn't actually break off. This is called Papava bracteatum, and it isn't actually native to India. It occurs from Turkey eastwards to Iran, and I've been waiting for howls of protest about having it on the cover of the book, but no one has yet. But other than its beauty, it was included as an example of the plant exchanges that by this date were going on through an international network of botanical gardens, which was facilitated by Royal, who was by now back in London, acting as the botanical advisor and distribution agent for the East India Company. So he must have got seeds from Central Asia and sent them back to Saharanpur. The founder of Saharanpur, George Govan, was only there for 4 years before he returned to Scotland, where he got married, and the couple returned to India, where he was posted to a geological survey of the Himalayas, and they based themselves in Simla, one of the earliest houses in Simla in the late 1820s. His wife, Mary Maitland, was interested in botany and herself an artist, and the couple continued to add to George's collection made earlier in Saharanpur. She did make a few drawings for the collection, but despite what it says on the printed label at the top right, most of the drawings are not by her. Most of them are by Indian artists. It can sometimes be difficult to say if a drawing is in a Western or an Indian hand, but ones like this exquisite study of the perfume-producing vetiver growth is undoubtedly Indian. Many of them bear Devanagari script, giving the place and the date of the collection, which was almost certainly written by the artist. And if he was recruited in Simla, may, like Lakshman Singh, have been of the Pahari school. Copying has always been a common practice in Indian art, with none of the European obsession with originality. I mentioned that Roxburgh had 2 sets of drawings made, and when studying collections of Indian natural history drawings, one frequently comes across versions of the same drawing made for different patrons. In 1831, Christian Lady Dalhousie, the mother of the Marquis Dalhousie, visited Simla, where she collected plants and employed a local artist. She visited the Govens and had copies made of some of their drawings. In this case, so the Govan drawing is the one on the left. Only you can see the Devanagari script there, as you can on the Dalhousie drawing, which is the one on the right. And the question is, which is the original and which is the copy? And I think it's fairly obvious that the one on the right must have been made from nature because of the irregular spotting of the PTL, which has been highly stylised in the equally beautiful but different version on the left. But both these drawings have ended up at Kew by different routes. Lady Dalhousie gave William Hooker her small collection of drawings, and the much larger Govan collection came later, when given by these rather proud sons who obviously believed their mother could draw very well. We saw earlier that shriveled bit of hay, the prangos. Well, here it is in its full glory, painted by one of Falconer's later artists around 1840, with these extraordinary analytical details of the individual florets in the bottom right-hand corner. The last gallery of the four painted with ruby red walls immediately before the sort of saturated indigo of the Singh's gallery is devoted to the Gangetic plain between the gardens of Saharanpur and Calcutta, the provinces of Awadh, Bihar and Bengal, which the East India Company took over in stages by force of arms and dodgy deals. These, of course, had catastrophic consequences for the indigenous population as it proceeded to extract obscene wealth from the area. The horrors included not only the Bengal famine, in which some 10 million people died, but the cynical employment of applied botany, the forcing of tenant farmers to grow crops such as indigo and opium. As the historical hit back against such practices forms the major theme of the Singh Twins exhibition, we decided not to emphasise this aspect in ours, which concentrates on a more positive aspect of the colonial encounter, the taxonomic, evolutionary and biogeographical studies of plants that underpin all efforts towards conservation. However, to avoid accusations of art washing, it was essential to include one drawing in which this darker history is encoded. And whilst there's no stunning image at Kew of indigo, rather oddly, there is one of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, whose baleful influence haunts the world to this day. This drawing comes from the Freer collection, in which there are two very distinct elements, distinguished by date and style. This is from the group made in the 1790s, which are uniquely stylised and also painted on French paper. All the other drawings are painted on European paper, on English Whatman paper. And whilst the drawings are all annotated by Freer, I think it's possible that he acquired an earlier collection, perhaps commissioned by a French patron somewhere like Chandernagore. The company had a monopoly over the growing and processing of opium in Bengal and Bihar, which it ruthlessly enforced, as recently exposed in clinical detail by Amitav Ghosh in his Smoke and Ashes. And in Bihar, the company insisted on growing only the white-flowered form, which is rather odd because the latex of the red and purple-flowered varieties is equally potent, and these were much more colourfully grown in Western India, where the company didn't have control over cultivation and processing. This drawing of the aquatic plant Nymphoides indica shows several stories of the sort that have been revealed through close study. I've mentioned the Freer collection several times, partly because it's one of my favourites, but until my work at Kew, its commissioner was unknown. Despite the fact that the annotations are clearly in an 18th century hand, it had always been known as the Hooker collection. I'd known it for many years as parts of it are in Edinburgh, but despaired ever of finding out anything about it. But this drawing proved to be the key. It's the only one in a collection of 400 drawings annotated with a place name in the bottom right-hand corner. This is Berhampore, which rang a bell because it was where Freer, one of Hope's best pupils in the 1760s, had died in 1811. The dates fitted, and I then confirmed the distinctive handwriting with known Freer manuscripts. But there's also a botanical story here. Identifying and applying correct modern names to the plants depicted was an important part of the project. But the fruiting stem, the one curving down to the bottom left, belongs to a different species to the rest of the drawing. It's actually a Sagittaria, and it grows in the same ponds as the Nymphoides and has similarly shaped leaves. But when the artist wanted to add a fruit to the drawing, he must have collected the wrong stem in the same pond. Fortunately, the Kew taxonomist failed to notice this, or it would have been chopped up. I mentioned earlier that it isn't always easy to say whether a drawing is in an Indian or a European hand, and it's very important to be upfront about this. Works in the Claude Martin collection made in Lucknow in the 1790s are a case in point. While some, in terms of layout and technique, are clearly Indian, others, like this beautiful hibiscus, might easily be attributed to a European hand. One reason for thinking otherwise, but one can never be certain, is that Martin had several identical versions of each drawing made, probably intended as gifts for friends. It seems unlikely that a European artist would have been willing or even capable of making such accurate facsimiles, whereas for an Indian artist it would have been standard practice. One aspect of the drawings I've always been keen to stress is the diversity of the backgrounds of artists available for commissioning by company surgeons and others. This is not only the case in differences between the north and the south. Shown here are two images of the same plant, Rumex vesicarius, a green vegetable, made within a few hundred miles of each other in Bengal or Bihar within a single decade. From the European-looking one by one of Claude Martin's artists on the left, something altogether more stylized and stranger from the early Freer collection. And the last drawing I'll show is one of my favourites, if most bizarre, also from the early Freer collection. Another depiction of the Singara nut, if you remember the much more detailed one from the Roxburgh collection earlier. This is unique, not known in the cross-hatching shown to show its watery habitat. It's a floating plant. But the almost sci-fi stylization of the spiky fruits is equally unique, if anything resembling a 16th century woodcut. So the exhibition, as I said at the beginning, it opened to the public on the 11th of October. And in its publicity, Kew has made it clear that the Singh twins is the main event. When I arrived at Kew for the opening, I was rather taken aback to find this graphically expressed on the facade of the gallery. No image of one of Kew's own stunning drawings, only one from the Singh twins, to which the Flora Indica exhibition is billed in smaller font as running alongside. Advertisements on the London Underground make no mention of Flora Indica, and risk the assumption on the part of rushing commuters that the exhibition represents the apotheosis of the Empress of India, which is as far from the twins' intention as it's possible to imagine. I simply can't understand the lack of confidence this suggests on Kew's part as to the importance of its own collection and the interest to the public. But comments in the visitors' book show that they may need to change their ideas. Despite the hitches, the exhibition looks good and hopefully conveys a taste of the excitement and sense of achievement that Sita and I had in revealing some of the long-hidden stories, re-establishing lost links between parts of the collection, and above all, being able to put artists' names to many of the drawings and presenting them to the public. As for the exhibition's legacy, one aspect is the planned Indian tour in facsimile form. Another, of course, is the book. for which the Kew Publications Department did a wonderful job, especially in choosing the brilliant designer Octavius Murray of the Murray Publishing dynasty. The main chapters are on the themes of the 4 galleries. Then comes one on the history of the Kew collection. But perhaps the most important part is the appendix, in which I've summarised what is known of 22 artists' lives. But this, however, is pitifully little beyond names and dates, and my fervent hope is that others can build on this and try to find more about the artists. But I want to end the talk by expressing my deep gratitude to Priya Kapoor of Rowley Books, and to say how sad I am that she can't be here, because she's currently stuck in Dubai along with many other people. But her brother Kapil is here. Thank you for and for the wonderful job they've done in making the Kew book available at a more affordable price in India. It's actually printed on slightly better paper. But I must also thank Ratish Nanda and the Aga Khan Foundation for allowing the talk to happen in this beautiful setting. Thank you very much.
Hi, Henry. What do you think about plant exchange? There's quite a sort of tangled web over there, isn't there?
Well, you wouldn't have tomatoes and potatoes if it weren't for plant exchanges. I mean, you know, some is good, some is bad. I mean, obviously plants that have become invasive are a major problem. I've just seen an example in the grounds here. You know, Prosopis juliflora was brought in from Mexico as a forest plant. It's become a complete and utter pest. But you know, some of the exchanges have been hugely to the benefit of mankind. I mean, yes, quinine was brought from South America under rather dodgy. I mean, it was poached from under the Spanish, but it's saved millions and millions of lives from malaria. So it's very difficult to make simple. That it's like the whole decolonialization story. It's nothing. It's not good or bad. It's every shade between.
A lot of the fossils which have survived in India. This is from Saharanpur towards Ambala. There is a fossil park, and there's a lot of it is Falconer's work. That collection has survived here, but very few plant fossils there. It's mostly animal fossils. Is there a collection of plant fossils which has gone from, say, this Falconer's collection, which is the Saharanpur collection? Is there anything that you are aware of? Where is a set of plant fossils, especially Falconer's?
I'm afraid I don't really know anything about that. I mean, the Faulkner ones of the mammals and reptiles are the, you know, things that he's best known for. I mean, him and Proby Courtley, when they were digging the canals, found these extraordinary Miocene fossils, including the giant turtle, which Faulkner charmingly, he was trying to link ancient Indian history with. That there could have been people around at the same time as these fossils. I mean, now not known to be remotely true, but it was a lovely idea, and there's a fantastic cartoon of him balanced on an elephant, balanced on the top of the turtle. But there are plant fossils from there, and I've never seen them, and the only reason I know is that in the Royal's illustrations of the botany of the Himalayan mountains, one plate does have some plant fossils, but if they've survived, they will be in the Natural History Museum in London, where the main collection of the mammal fossils.
Nothing in the Kews.
No, Kew doesn't have any fossils.
Plant fossils.
There were these sort of divisions. So, yeah, when the Indian Museum was dispersed in 1879, any geological material would have gone to the Natural History Museum. Well, that's not quite true, because the Natural History Museum wasn't founded till 1881, so it was still the British Museum, which included what's now the British Library, the British Museum and the Natural History Museum. But when everything went south. Kensington, the fossils would have gone there.
Yes, I wanted to know where one can find the Claude Martin collection. I mean, is the entire collection at Kew Gardens, or is there some in India? And what about the birds? You mentioned that there were birds also. Where can one see this collection apart from Kew Gardens?
The botanical drawings are all at Kew. The bird ones were sold and dispersed about 20 years ago. There was a sale in London, so they're all over the place, I'm afraid. But a catalogue wasn't, well, it was about 50 of them were sold, and there is an illustrated catalogue which has reproductions of all the birds.
Hello. So I was wondering if you could tell something about the scene of botanical art in the Indian subcontinent before the colonization period. I think you mentioned that there wasn't much attention paid to scientific details when it came to botanical art, but if there's something more to that, I would be very interested in knowing. Yeah.
I'm afraid I really know very, very little about earlier traditions of painting. I mean, obviously the Mughals did do plant paintings, but usually they were very, very stylized and made symmetrical, and often would combine details of one species with another. So I actually hate it when people send me things saying, what is this? Because usually it isn't anything, or it's several things joined together. But there were exceptions. There's a famous album which I think is now in Tehran, actually. I hope it still exists, which has very accurate plant drawings in it. But the interesting thing about it is that many of the drawings in it are actually copies of European wood engravings. So there's a funny one of what's actually in the original herbal called a white lily, but the Mughal artist has made it orange. But they were more interested in making motifs for things like inlaying in pietra dura, and they just weren't terribly interested in naturalism.
Was there any exchange domestically? So, for example, the Royal Botanical Gardens with, say, the princely states or something, maybe there were some monarchs who was like-minded and also commissioning art, and which was more faithful to natural illustrations?
Well, there is one very good example, and that's in the south, in Tanjore. Roger Serfoji had naturalistic birds and plants drawn. His bird drawings are now in the British Library, but there are at least 2 volumes in the amazing Saraswati Mahal Library in Tanjore of very naturalistic plant drawings. And I mean, because I haven't been able to talk about the south, there was a very different tradition of painting in roundabout Tanjore in the early years of the 19th century, and the British patrons did use them extensively, and they came from the North Indian painters came from probably remnants of Mughal ateliers, but in the south they came from much more vernacular traditions. I mentioned Roxburgh, his painters were probably textile painters, but in Tanjore they belonged to a caste called Muchis, which is very odd because that means leather workers, but leather workers also did paintings, and I didn't believe it for a long time, but then I found a drawing there were these drawings of castes where you had a man and a wife, annotated by a Brit saying, Muchi caste, and the drawing of the Muchi by the Muchi and his wife shows him holding a leather saddle. So, they really were, it was these group, who actually originally came from Andhra Pradesh. So a lot of the annotations on their drawings are actually in Telugu, even though they're made in Tamil Nadu. But other princely states or rulers I haven't come across, but that's not to say that there might be things hiding around. Actually, can think of another example. In Jaipur, I was amazed once at Dilli Haat to find, these Jaipur painters copy endlessly from all sorts of sources, old books, onto old paper with bits of manuscript on them. And one of them I saw a painting of a bulb which I recognised was actually from a famous book by Redoute on the family Liliaceae, and I've never been able to. And I then later found a copy of another of Redoute's drawings made in Jaipur in the 1920s. So I suspect that in the Royal Library there must be a copy of Redoute's Liliaceae, and it's been copied by generations of Jaipur artists.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. I think that was very, very, very insightful. And we hope that this work continues, and we hope that we can spread this book to many, many readers in India. Thank you so much.